This talk has come about because of the 2020-21 COVID-19 pandemic and is delivered remotely because of travel restrictions and limits in indoor gatherings brought in to protect everybody from spreading and/or contracting the infection. It's about a pandemic that was thought might come into the country in 1771 but didn't. I'm not an expert in Dr Brownrigg's life or on his medical advice or suggestions or on the transmission of contagious diseases, but I came across his work whilst trying to gain an insight into all those who had written about the history of salt making, their techniques and technology. Dr Brownrigg was one of those. There are many such descriptions, and an understanding about how and when and by whom they were written is important in assessing their reliability. Dr Brownrigg just happens to have been a doctor who used his scientific training to address local industrial processes of interest to those he worked for, and which might also be improved for the national good, and I'm pleased to be able to bring his considerations to the notice of this Congress. As I said, my introduction to Brownrigg was through his 1748 publication, The Art of Making Common Salt, about how the manufacture of white salt could be improved. It comes with full references for existing authors and all the methods used to make white salt. His proposals then had been prompted by war with Spain that had cut off imported salt supplies. The Art of Making Common Salt was read at the Royal Society in June 1748, when it's said to be one of the most important technical papers for the last 50 years. I've digitally reconstructed the techniques from his technical drawing produced in his paper to describe how new salt houses could improve the salt making process described by Agricola, published in 1556 in De Re Metallica, and to make better quality salt and employ new methods of building cold furnaces that could be more economical. William Brownrigg was born at Highclose Hall, Plumland, Cumberland. He was educated locally and received tuition in Greek and Latin from the vicar at Bridekirk, and at the age of 15 became apprenticed to a Carlisle surgeon/apothecary for 5 years, before starting his medical studies in London for 2 years, and thereafter at the University of Leiden, Holland, for the next 3 years. At Leiden University, Brownrigg studied under the renowned Dr Herman Boerhaave at Leiden University, an institution that trained many of those who were cited by Brownrigg in his paper on contagious pestilence. His dissertation was written in Latin and described how air, climate and the environment relates to medical practice, and was well received, and he gained his doctorate in medicine in 1737. He moved back to Cumberland to work for Richard Stenhouse, an apothecary, who was also a graduate from Leiden University, and continued to practice when Stenhouse died in October of that year. Whitehaven was dominated by Sir James Lowther's collieries, and Brownrigg became interested in the salt-making aspects of the business when Lowther was trying to use coal to enhance his wealth and profits. Bird's eye view of Whitehaven was commissioned by Lowther, and it shows modern, impressive housing, but that hides the inequalities of houses that were occupied by the working classes. And even in 1848, the local board only recorded 11 public water fountains for a population of over 16,000 people. Whilst working as a doctor in the area, he kept a casebook written in Latin, and amongst many cases he treated, he cites outbreaks of epidemic fever in 1737 and 1743, to which he himself almost fell victim. Ward and Yell have translated the casebook and made an analysis of the people he treated and the diseases that they had. In 1770 he retired and went to work to live at his family estate at Ormthwaite Hall, where he continued his experiments and writing. In 1771, fearing that a new wave of infections was likely to come into the country from abroad, he published Considerations on the Means of Preventing and Communication of Pestilent Contagion and of Eradicating it in Infected Places. In it, he offered to the consideration of the public a few observations, with proper conclusions for them deduced on this important subject. Saying that having been acquainted with properties of the contagion with directly to means of preventing and its spreading and of removing it from infected places, all of which rendered further publication on this subject necessary. Towards the end of the publication, Brownrigg referenced his personal experience of dealing with the outbreaks of typhus in Whitehaven in 1757, when, while treating infected people, he was seized with the fever and a fellow surgeon died. The following year the disease spread to Workington and Cockermouth, where 2 other surgeons also died of it. As in the art of making common salt, Brownrigg includes many references, particularly citing Dr Sydenham, Dr Hodges, Dr Mead, as well as John Pringle and Dr Lind, with numerous others. Dr Sydenham was mentioned by Boerhaave and said by him to be the light of England, the skill of Apollo, and the true face of Hippocrates. He'd been educated at All Souls, Oxford, and at Pembroke College, Cambridge, where the aphorism, "First do no harm," is attributed to him by the English surgeon Thomas Inman in the 19th century. Dr Nathaniel Hodges had written an account of the plague in London, and Brownrigg refers to this with many of the details to put the possibilities of the contagion that was likely to come into the country in context. Dr Richard Mead wrote the first major publication on pestilential contagion in 1720. He'd studied at Utrecht and then went to Leiden himself to study medicine. And he graduated in philosophy and physics in Padua and then was admitted to the Royal Society in 1703. And there are some publications detailing the background of his work and publications on this slide. Sir John Pringle, also a graduate at Leiden University, and like Brownrigg was a winner of the Copley Medal, he became a travelling companion of Benjamin Franklin, and both Pringle and Franklin visited Ormathwaite Hall, and Brownrigg did numerous experiments with them in his purpose-built laboratory. James Lind was also a friend of Brownrigg. He'd done the first clinical trials studying the effect of citrus fruit on scurvy in 1747 and had written a paper on fevers and infections in ships and in jails. Perhaps put into context how these were actually received, it took another 50 years for his recommendations of lime juice to be introduced across the Navy as a whole, only on the insistence of Admiral Lord St Vincent. In the considerations, Brownrigg starts with a consideration of the quarantine laws of 1710 and 1721. The History of Parliament blog site gives an account of some of these. Where the disease is desperate, the remedy must be also. And Brownrigg then covers some of the penalties for breaking quarantine, and there was much debate associated with these punishments. The breaking of quarantine law for those found guilty suffered the pain of death, as in the case of felony. And there was a great deal of debate about lockdowns, about quarantine, and the proper measures were taken. If proper measures were taken, the infection might be confined within narrow limits of a street or lane, said Brownrigg, and people should not object against the seclusion of a small part of such large cities if the preservation of all its other parts and the whole of the nation from so dreadful a calamity came about as a result. Brownrigg proposed that for the subsistence of the inhabitants of the individual places, all kinds of necessaries should be furnished at the public expense. He says it would be easy to show what necessaries would be chiefly wanted, but it was his intention in this paper to point out a general plan without entering into a minute detail of every particular. It's this detailed planning perhaps what proved to be most difficult during the initial phases of our current pandemic for those isolated, quarantined or shielding, and it may prove to be so if needed in the future. He suggested that physicians, surgeons and all proper attendants should be provided at the public expense, and I don't really know how that went down in the 18th century, but even now the pay and the conditions of our NHS workers has taken up a great deal of debate and media time. He suggested the creation of a board of health to advise, to make due inquisitions, receive intelligence and assist in the execution of such orders as shall be made by His Majesty in Council, as had been long established in Portugal, Spain, Sweden and Switzerland. And today, who is giving the advice, where they're getting their information from, has also taken up a great deal of media time. He suggested that the sick should be treated in small numbers, in private houses, rather than in large hospitals, where there might be poisonous heated air, and in noisy, crowded places. He was also aware that the signs by which the disease is known and distinguished from others had not yet been put forth in any Act of Parliament. And very early in our pandemic, there was a lot of coverage on what the symptoms were of the coronavirus. How did you know you got it, and what should you do afterwards? Brownrigg suggested that contagion was prevented by spreading by entirely cutting off all communication between those places, persons and things, and that therefore they're therewith infected, and those that are free from its contagion. And again, lockdown rules, quarantine and movement was a big part of our pandemic story. The warnings about travelling were underlined by a review of deaths experienced by people fleeing London during the last plague, and the transmission of the disease to show those they met on their transmission of the disease to those they met on their journey and in crowded accommodation that they stayed in. He quotes that in the London Plague of 1665, an allowance of 8d per day was paid to each person so shut up, but powers were also given to tax inhabitants in infected places. And the main problems with shutting people up and quarantining them and preventing movement is the fact that businesses can't trade, people can't go to work, and the furlough schemes and the other incomes were necessary within our own methods of coping with this pandemic from the very beginning. He quotes the figures of 34,417 deaths in London during the London Plague of 1625, and how the numbers varied by month and by location, with 10,400 deaths reported in 1626. The recorded deaths due to COVID and of the number of people infected will probably keep statisticians in work for some years to come, particularly the exclusion of people who died within the 28 days, died more than 28 days after a positive test result, skews many of the figures, without considering those who may continue to suffer from long COVID symptoms in the distant future. The contagion that Brownrigg and others feared didn't come into this country, but hindsight will judge how prepared we've been for COVID-19, how we dealt with it, how we experienced the measures put in place to cope with it, and what its legacy will be. But the COVID-19 fight is not yet over, despite the take-up of the excellent vaccination schemes. So remember, hands, face, space, and stay safe. Thank you.